Can you imagine the worst life possible? One filled with anger, abuse, torture, and eternal damnation? And if you lived that life, the question would become, how could you escape it? One game gave us a look into a dire situation just like this. Based on the original short story from famous author Harlan Ellison, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream told the story of the last 5 people alive on Earth. In this timeline, during the Cold War, the Third World War began to break out, and in order to manage the immense amount of decisions to be made, the United States, China, and Russia constructed 3 massive supercomputers that put the war into a stalemate. But after numerous advancements, the American AI, codenamed AM, gained sentience and took over the entire world with a distinct hatred for humanity, killing everyone except for 5 individuals, who would soon realize their fate would be the worst of all. In the short story, these 5 go on a journey to find food, told from one of them called Ted, who is the narrator. Each of them has been augmented by AM so they do not die even when starving and dehydrated, and also they can live forever. So for the last 109 years, they have all suffered endlessly under AM's rule in an Earth covered in wires and electrical equipment that all make up AM, with the biomes of the world being at the 5 prisoners' feet, and above them being a massive dome of computer parts and only some holes at the top that let light in from a now desolate Earth. And throughout this story, the 5 remaining human beings are subjugated to some of the most horrific and disturbing torture ever, including AM nailing their feet to the ground during an earthquake and ripping their tendons to shred, only to glue them back together, causing a month-long hurricane that the 5 must endure, constantly passing out and losing consciousness. One of the survivors, Benny, being so mutilated that he de-evolves into half-man, half-ape, and even the survivor Ellen, the one woman in the group, being forced by AM to provide sexual favors for all the others, with each of them developing major psychological ailments, including hallucinations from the unreliable narrator Ted himself. In the end of the short story, the survivors end up going crazy, learning that the food they had dreams of finding was in fact in the ice caves they traveled to, but that AM had tricked them and made the food inaccessible, causing Benny to fly into a rage and start eating the face of one of the other survivors, with the screams of pain causing icicles from the cave to fall to the ground. Ted, realizing this is the first time they have had access to weapons in over 100 years, grabs an icicle and starts to kill the other survivors in order to save them from eternal damnation. And when it comes down to just him and Ellen, he does the heroic thing and kills her, leaving just him alone now to be tortured by AM, who for hundreds of years turns him into something not even recognizable as a human being. However, in the game, the story's a little different. All the background characters are the same, but the ending is retconned some, and instead, all the characters are given a challenge to play a game for AM, where each must tackle their biggest fears and regrets. It's one of the most psychological games of all time, where you play through 5 different campaigns diving into the psyche of each of the survivors, their wants, desires, and regrets from their past lives. For example, in Ellen's campaign, you must confront a man who assaulted her in an elevator in a previous life, where Anne brings him back to life to eternally molest Ellen in her own hell. But in each of the campaigns, by either learning how to handle each situation and/or by doing virtuous things like in Nimdok's campaign, deciding not to do more experiments on human beings like he did as a Nazi scientist, then you anger AM and he will cast each of the survivors into a prison of pain, including cages with lasers constantly shooting at them or blazing hot ovens that they're eternally stuck in. And it's only by beating all 5 of these campaigns and forcing AM into a massive outburst of anger do you finally get the last sequence of the game where it's discovered that those long-lost Chinese and Russian supercomputers from the Third War have actually infiltrated AM and allowed all the survivors to trick and best him. And now it's your job to turn off AM's id, superego, and ego. For those that don't know, in Freudian psychology, the human psyche is separated into 3 main parts: the id, or instincts, which is humans' capacity for evil, the superego, or morality, which is humans' capacity for goodness, and the ego, which is the sense of self that moderates between the two. So in the end of the game, you must solve the riddle of besting each of AM's psyches. For example, showing your natural human goodness, which will destroy AM's id, since it cannot contemplate how humans would be so kind to a machine that tortured them for over 100 years endlessly. And it's at the end of the game that we defeat AM and learn that on the moon, 700 humans are being kept in cryogenic stasis, meaning that the human race has a chance to live on and thrive once again. But to me, the most interesting part of the game is the questions it asks us. And maybe the most interesting of all of these is, how can we escape hell? In both the short story and the game's narratives, it seems like all hope is lost. No matter what the survivors do, their lives are as bad as it can get, it seems. But while the ending of each is bleak, they both give us a sense of hope in a way. In the short story, Ted becoming a monster who has no mouth but must scream is an analogy to the fact that in the end, through all the pain he had to endure, Am too was forced to find eternal pain, realizing that it no longer had any humans to torture, meaning its meaning in life was gone. And in the game, we learn that by being kind in the face of utter destruction and torture led to Am finally being bested. If you were one day to be cast into this insane and unbelievable world made up by Harlan Ellison, how would you handle it? What would be the best way to deal with a life not worth living, yet one you could never end? A world that stripped you of all of your humanity and subjugated you to the worst life a human being could possibly live. Well, maybe even in the worst depths of our human condition, there's always something inside of us that can flourish, an eternal light and a fire in our souls that guides us to the good. In each of the 5 campaigns we play in game, only by making the courageous and righteous choices do we trick Am and escape. And at the end of the short story, Ted kills Ellen, freeing her from her eternal prison, even though he hated her before. It's the selfless and kind acts we can make as humans, even in the face of pure evil, that are what make us human. A propensity within all of us to do the right thing, even if for hundreds of years we see nothing but pain. So if by chance one day you ever find yourself in hell, either the Christian one, Ellison's, or even your very own, remember that there's always a part of us, a superego, that tends towards the light, and maybe the only way to truly defeat real evil is to show it that something else exists. Only by proving to Am that humans can be good in the face of unrelenting sadness does his evil cease to exist. So maybe if you want to see a change in the world, if you're tired of suffering, anger, and sadness, then you have to realize there's only one thing you can do. Be kind, be courageous, and do the right thing. And maybe you will still be trapped in that eternal prison despite all of it, but you will inspire or change the hearts of others, and lead to a world where 700 humans can still live and recreate again, or one where you know you did the right thing. A world worth living in. Have you ever wondered what it is that makes someone evil? What it is that separates those of us who are good and righteous from those who are wicked and dishonorable? Well, maybe it's nothing at all. Because you see, while humans often strive for the good, there is a capacity within all of us to become and live the life of a monster, one that we can't ever come to terms with. And in Spec Ops: The Line, we confront this scary fact of life head on, in a story full of twists, turns, and confusing and sadistic hallucinations. Based somewhat on the famous novel The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, Spec Ops: The Line tells the story of a band of 3 covert operatives that are sent into Dubai after a massive sandstorm has obliterated the region, evacuating the entire city and casting the remaining survivors into all-out war and death. Early on in the game, we discovered that a large regiment of United States soldiers called the 33rd Battalion had originally infiltrated the city, denying direct orders from the United States government to leave, instead opting to go in and help the remaining survivors. We play as a man named Martin Walker, who's part of a small team of 3 covert operatives the United States has tasked with going in and finding out what happened to the 33rd Battalion. And early on, we slowly uncovered through Walker's visions that the United States soldiers had actually been attacking and subjugating the civilians to sick and twisted torture in order to gain power over the region. The leader of the 33rd Battalion is a man named John Conrad, and Walker is in constant contact with him throughout the game, disgusted with how sick of a man he is. But the big reveal of the story is that what we have been experiencing is nothing more than a fake reality. You see, Walker wasn't right about the battalion being the bad guys. There's a moment in game where you stumble upon a large group of the 33rd Battalion guarding a building you want to get into because you think they're holding civilians hostage. And in order to get past them, Walker makes the call to launch a mortar filled with white phosphorus at them, killing them all in a horrific and painful death. But as you walk past one of the few remaining soldiers slowly dying, you learn that the civilians are not being held captive, but instead were being saved by the soldiers. You just murdered and killed innocents for no reason. But Walker can't accept this and continues on his path of bloodshed until at the end of the game, he finally goes to meet his main enemy, Conrad, the leader of the battalion, only to find out that he has been dead the whole time. What you just experienced The entire game almost is nothing but a man reliving the sick and twisted hell in his mind that he's created for himself, after the unbelievably heinous acts he has committed and struggled to come to terms with. It's why throughout the game we can see strange visions, like light posts that are normal, only for a few seconds later to be filled with dead and hanged civilians that never existed, or murals of death and despair all over the city that make no sense. Walker was a man with good intentions, but out of his own ignorance and mistakes, committed acts that would only be befitting of the most evil of people. And it's because of this that Walker in many ways began to lose his mind and succumb to the darkness within himself, within all of us. Because within each of us is that sense of darkness, a primal way of being that we hide and strip away from good company. Men and women willing to kill, murder, and torture in the name of survival, instincts, and damnation. When pushed to the very edges of our humanity, we become a monster the likes of which we could never imagine. But we as humans too always strive to see ourselves as good. And so in Walker's case, it was impossible for him to accept the fact that he was a monster all along, not the so-called leader of the 33rd Battalion, John Conrad. In a way, Walker and Conrad in the game were nothing more than the split personalities of the same man driven to insanity. Conrad represented the evil within Walker, and the man we played as represented the heroic and brave leader who would save innocents at any cost. The end of the game, where we can decide to accept the truth of our reality or instead continue on in our lie, is a perfect parallel to the struggles of evil in our real world. Many times those who commit evil acts don't see it that way. They see themselves as heroes, ones needed to fight back against chaos and injustice. And because of an innate need as human beings to strive for the good, sometimes we can completely create fake realities that justify the actions we have committed. It's horrifying to come to terms with the fact that we all have the capacity to be monsters, to be the evil with which we strive to rid the world of. And maybe the scariest part of all is that throughout history we have seen what this evil can do. Soldiers coming back from war with PTSD, killers refusing to accept the truth of who they are, or simply rejecting their humanity entirely. There's a hell within all of us that, should we let it, can become our prison. And it's only by accepting our capacity for bad that we can relish our equally beautiful capacity for good. Maybe the most powerful moment in this entire game isn't the ending or the realization that everything we just lived was a lie from a truly evil man convincing himself he's the hero. The most powerful moment actually comes from one of the loading screens you get in-game if you die and reload that simply says, "To kill for yourself is murder, to kill for your government is heroic, to kill for entertainment is harmless." We often don't think about the murder and heinous acts we commit in games like Spec Ops: The Line. But if anything, they are just an indication of our capacity and desire for evil, even if it's just in small part. And only by fighting against this side of ourselves and admitting it exists can we make sure we never fall into the depths of our own minds, the deepest stage of hell that Dante's Inferno forgot about. If you want to be a truly positive force in the world, part of that comes from your own capacity to realize your propensity and ability for evil too. That way you never get lost in your own hell. Some big ideas to think about.